Douglas Trumbull. Really grateful that you came to join us today. Just fantastic.
Well, I love Rhode Island, and my stepson went to RISD, so our whole family has spent a lot of time here, and we love it here in Providence.
Super. And we'll do a Q&A afterwards like we did last time for the audience if they have any questions. But I wanted to talk to you first about, you've been doing this for, I guess, I want to say like 50 years.
Yeah.
50 years. Did you have films or filmmakers that inspired you to get into the industry to begin with?
I had no clue I was going to get into the movie industry when I was in school, but I was an avid reader of science fiction stories, so I had this imagination running wild on alien planets and other worlds, and I was watching The Wonderful World of Disney every Sunday night, and they had amazing documentaries about the making of Disneyland and how they did multiplane photography that Johnny was talking about, and all the stuff, the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff I was always fascinated with. And it wasn't until I got out of art school that I took my portfolio around looking for a job, and they said, well, you should be doing space movies. I said, oh, really? Okay. So that's kind of where it started.
Were you into the old Buster Crabbe cereals?
Oh yeah, I have stacks of them.
Yeah, and
old VHS tapes.
Yep, and some of the. What about comic books? Was there any?
Well, there's Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and Scrooge McDuck, and all those Disney things, and I used them in Silent Running.
Silent Running, right? Yeah. So, was your dad also doing like aerospace or?
No, before I was born, my father was a young visual effects rigger in Hollywood, and he worked on The Wizard of Oz, among many other movies. And he was off to the side with a fishing rod and a monofilament line pulling the lion's tail.
Oh.
And rigging the flying monkeys and
apples, maybe apples
trees,
falling from trees.
All kinds of stuff like that. He got out of the movie industry shortly after that, before I was born, actually,
yep.
And went into the aerospace industry. So he was in that until I brought him back a zillion years later to work on Silent Running with me.
Which, again, you talked, how Walt Disney was using those behind the scenes to kind of get the audiences excited about Disney, the Disney parks and all that. And I look at your films and how, the behind the scenes, and it's so inspiring. I'm so glad you captured all that stuff.
Well, thank you. We keep doing that. I like teaching.
Yep.
I like letting people know how we do these things. And it's really a fun experiment. I like the whole world of adventure through experimentation, because movies are really a technical art form.
Yes.
And so I feel a kind of a personal passion for the process of experimentation and never doing the same thing twice, and never relying on the same old.
Well,
I always want to do something different, or I'm bored.
I think what's incredible is the films that we are all so used to seeing in the new generations of audience goers. They see these films and they don't always realize where some of these ideas have sprung from, and they're usually from you.
Well, they're not just from me. I mean, there's a very long history of how illusions are made. That goes way back to stage illusions and Méliès and
Fritz Lang
and lighting and smoke and wires.
I know, but I'm talking about like some of the looks or the, you see your influence on Star Wars. You see your influences on all of the films that are happening today that, you were doing back in the late 60s or 70s. That your imagery has come forward. And I don't know if people realize that. I am in such awe of you.
Oh, shucks.
Let's go, and you tell me if I'm going to miss, is there something that you want to talk about from the idea whether you said, you should do science fiction movies to 2001? Like, what's happening in between that time?
Well, I guess the main theme that I like talking about, which really began before 2001 when we were working on a film called To the Moon and Beyond for the New York World's Fair, which was a 70 millimeter giant screen movie projected into a hemispherical dome like a planetarium. And it was a trip to the moon and beyond and through other dimensions in time and space. And I did all the artwork for it when I was very young, 22, 23 years old. And Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw that movie, and that kind of validated their desire to do 2001, that you could actually make a movie in 70 millimeter and it actually wouldn't look like a stupid Buster Crabbe
Right,
B-movie.
right.
It would look really seriously good. And so that's how I got my job on that movie. But the theme of my life up until this very day has been that I believe that movies can be extremely spectacular and immersive. Immersive is kind of the key word, which is I was very lucky to work with Stanley Kubrick on this movie that was on these giant 90 and 100 foot wide Cinerama screens, which aren't around hardly at all anymore. And the movie industry, instead of being what I thought it was going to be, I thought, well, I'm going to sign up. I love Stanley Kubrick. I love this movie. I think this is a great medium to be working in. And I didn't know that we were going to multiplex it to death and televisionize it to death in the sense that the screens just got smaller.
Yes.
They didn't get bigger. They got smaller. So the theme of my work has been to try to not only recover that kind of immersion and spectacle, but to go beyond it.
It's kind of interesting because with the advent of television, with the theaters were afraid that they were going to go out of business because television had arrived. So they said, we need to do it bigger, more spectacular, VistaVision and things such as that. So you had everything was big. And then I guess maybe on a business level, the studios were afraid to do the investments into all the theaters. So maybe, I'm not sure.
Well, the studios are separated from the theaters. The theaters are owned by exhibitors, and the movies are made by the studios that distribute their own movies to the theaters. And we're back in that exact same situation that we were then, where the studios were terrified that television was going to take their business away, and attendance at movie theaters was declining drastically. And so they all started spending serious money in developing D150 and Todd AO and Cinemeric. I mean, all these processes kind of came as a way to try to preserve the spectacle of movies. And then there was a big bump in that for a while. And then a few years later, the studios really realized they could produce for television.
Right.
So the studios became the source of content for television. And now we're in exactly the same situation today because attendance at movie theaters, at least in the United States, is in decline. It's been declining for quite a few years. And streaming and downloading and Netflix and Amazon are replacing it with convenience. And, you know, you can look at a movie on your smartphone or your tablet or your computer or whatever. And so access is inexpensive and super convenient. And people say, well, why should I go out to the movie theater? I got to park, I got to feed the kids, I got to get a babysitter or whatever. And so there's not enough of a draw to get audiences back into theaters.
Right.
And that's one of the things I'm really determined to solve, and I'm working on it.
Make sure you see Blade Runner in 2001 and all these other films on the big screen, not on your little hand
Well,
device.
you can't even find as big a screen as we had in those days.
I know.
It's really not there.
Okay, so now let's go to the working on 2001 with Stanley Kubrick, and I'd love to talk about the experience of 2001, but also talk about the Kubrick effect, maybe on you as a person.
Yeah. Well, there was a really interesting process that Stanley Kubrick was going through in the making of 2001, because he had made conventional movies before that. You know, there's a huge list of them. But he
had done Spartacus, for those like Spartacus.
Spartacus and
Kirk Douglas.
That was
Passage
Kirk Douglas.
to Glory? No.
Paths of Glory was one of his early films, and then early films before that, and then Lolita, and then several other movies that I thought were really fabulously well directed. But when he got a hold of this 70 millimeter process and these giant screens, he felt a really powerful responsibility to create some kind of epic thing.
Right.
Some big immersive epic thing. And it started influencing his directorial style. And instead of doing conventional melodramatic coverage of a master shot and a two-shot and over the shoulder and a close-up and an insert, he started going straight for point-of-view shots and cutting out dialogue and getting rid of reverse angles because he wanted the audience to be on that adventure themselves.
Right.
And that's what led to these lengthy, I think there's one 17-minute period at least near the end of 2001 where there's no dialogue, there's no suspense, there's no people. It's just a big trip. And that was what he was seeking, and that was what so profoundly affected my career, is that say, well, we can really transport people outside your body or outside of your own consciousness, or you can go beyond dreams or beyond nightmares or beyond hallucinations or beyond drugs.
Right.
And that there's all this opportunity out there that's not really being explored or thought about, except in the very beginning days now of the rebirth of virtual reality. I don't know if anybody in this room is interested in virtual reality, but it's the hot new thing. There's a hot new guy right there.
Colangelo.
You know, exploring the whole idea of actually being in an environment,
right.
participating in a live thing and being able to look around as though you're there, and it's 3D,
yep.
and it's got surround sound or whatever. And so there's this quest that I think we all share.
Yes.
Is that we want to be immersed in something that goes beyond the limitations of everyday reality. You know, everyday reality we got every day. We are in this room, we're in this room. We watch TV, you watch TV. But we're also saturated with media. I mean, who would have known 20 years ago that we'd have 1,000 channels of television? You know, I mean, we could watch anything we want, anytime we want, anywhere we want. And so we're glutted with media that's, to me, much of it is similar to itself.
Mediocre?
I'm not going to say mediocre because
mediocre.
I see a lot of shows that are really beautifully done.
Yeah.
Well directed, well written, well thought out, well performed, well edited. Everything is really excellent.
But some of those channels are mediocre.
But they're...
I'm not talking about the ones you're talking about. I'm talking about some of those, maybe there's 500 channels that are crap. And then there's probably 150 channels that have some great content.
Okay, well, what I'm saying is that I don't want to disparage anything that's going on. What I'm trying to say is that I feel like a kind of a lone wolf in trying to explore how to go
immersive
beyond cinema into some immersive experience, and that's just almost uncharted territory.
Yep.
And I really like that. It's like I already climbed Everest. Now what's the next? Where's the next mountain?
Right.
You know.
Is that part of the Kubrick effect too? That he wanted to break rules all the time. Is that something that you guys bonded over?
Yeah, we very much did. And he would say openly to me, there wasn't many people he would talk to, and I was really kind of a mascot for Stanley because I was a young California kid. And he would say, you know, if everybody's doing that and that and that, I want to do exactly the opposite.
Right.
You give me a rule and I want to break it.
Right.
You say we're going to shoot that way, I want to shoot that way. And that was just his mentality, is just say, how can he put on the screen something that you've never seen before, in a form you've never seen before, a visual thing you've never seen before, or an experience you've never had before. And he was really onto that, and I really admired that, and it was profoundly affected me.
When you were doing that final sequence and using, was it slit screen?
Slit scan, yeah.
Slit scan. Can you talk about that and maybe what did he say? This is what I'm going for, and then you.
It was the slit scan thing, which was the Stargate corridor at the end of 2001, was one of the effects I spent a lot of time on. Oh, there
you go.
The project that was proposed by the movie itself, by the story and the concept that Arthur Clarke wrote, was that this character, or characters, because it was going to be more than one, it ended up being just one, are going to be transported through time and space to another place, to another dimension. That's really what the idea was. That's 50 years ago. And so the ideas for the Stargate were initially very literal. Even Arthur Clarke wrote that there was going to be kind of a slot in one of Jupiter's moons. And if you looked through the slot to the other end of the slot, you would see another dimension or another universe. And we tried to do that, and it just did not look good. And so the idea of actually creating a photographic process that used time and space as its basic component. Each of these frames of the Stargate took 2 minutes or 5 minutes to make, and it was a very thin slit. That's why it's called slit scan. It's a very, very thin slit, lit from behind. The room is completely black except for this thin slit. And we moved the camera toward the slit while we moved artwork behind the slit. And this created a plane of light in three-dimensional space that completely broke the dimension of the camera. And so every frame of film included 1,000 different focal distances, and it was pure light. It wasn't a physical object, it was pure light. And it was traveling, and you're traveling through it or whatever. And so this idea of time exposures, you know, if you take a time exposure of a freeway at night, you just leave your camera shutter open, you'll see all the headlights just become beams of light or little blinking red lights or whatever. And the whole idea of using time and space as a concept to create that effect meant I had to build a big machine to do that. And
that's why you're a genius.
My father was an engineer. I was around his welding shop and machine shop and drill press and sander. And I mean, I grew up on that stuff, so it was not daunting to me to use a tool to build a gizmo.
It's the mechanics and the art. You have both, the mechanics and the art.
I just think it's one of my attitudes about art. If you look back at the history of sculpture, for instance, you know, Michelangelo, who did David or whatever, he went to the quarry and he decided what rock he wanted, and he had to work with those guys and figure out how to chisel that rock out of the mountain, how to get it on a crate and move it to his studio.
Right.
Or Van Gogh or anybody else. They had to figure out how to grind different materials and make colors and put oils in there and make pasty stuff that you could paint with. I mean, it didn't come from nowhere.
Right.
These guys invented their own art form. And so I feel a responsibility to keep inventing or reinventing my art form as well.
Yep.
And so now it's very digital now.
Right.
It's less physical now. We're into a lot of computer graphics, and Johnny showed us some really cool stuff that I see, and I have friends who work in that world, and it's really quite amazing what you can do. And it's better than a lot of stuff we did mechanically or with optical printers or physical cameras. But there's still something about the kind of what I call the organic nature of things, which are paint and materials. And I like to work with tanks and fluids and stuff and create elements that then you use a computer graphics and compositing to add some organic element and enhance a real shot of a real place or a real set or a real prop or whatever. Just a combination.
How long did it take you to come up with the concept for the 2001, for this moment? And did you was there a lot of trials and tribulations?
Yeah, we struggled with it for a year and a half.
Wow. Before
we cracked it. And cracking it really came from another guy that I'd worked with way back on To the Moon and Beyond, a guy named John Whitney, who had made a little animation stand with a camera pointing down at a backlit piece of glass. Yep. And the piece of glass would move around in some weird patterns on cams and motors. And he would leave the shutter of the camera open for several seconds and accumulate light, which created a third layer of light that didn't exist in reality. It was only a time accumulation of light. It was a controlled blur.
Right.
And that's where I got the idea to do the Stargate, was take that idea, that fundamental idea, and just blow it up to 100 times bigger by building a much more complicated machine.
Did you have the pressures that you're going to have later on when we talk about Star Trek later, but did you have time pressure of there's a release date?
No.
That didn't happen, right?
Weirdly, this is a really weird story, because you're Johnny, right? There he is. He's talking about what everybody in the movie business experiences, which is a deadline.
Right.
Where the studio has locked in the release date of the movie 3 years previously.
Right.
Because any movie you see that hits a theater has been planned years in advance, even before the movie went into production. They know that release date. And so that becomes an unmovable deadline. On 2001, nobody knew where we were going or how we were going to get there, much less Stanley Kubrick or MGM.
Right.
And Stanley took it upon himself to insulate us from that. He never told us when it had to be done or how much time we had.
How cool is that?
He said, just do it right or I'm not satisfied. He was a tremendous perfectionist. So I was supposed to be on the movie for 9 months, and I was on it for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And
it was worth it.
And it was worth it, and it was a huge learning curve for me. That was my film school, working with him. And he was my mentor. And we were all going down this big adventure together. And it was a totally fabulous time for me and for him and for all of us to be able to feel like, yeah, we're doing something really new and fresh, and no one's ever seen this before, and isn't it cool? And it was humongously satisfying.
Stands the test of time.
Yeah, it still does, yeah.
Yeah. What about, so from there, I don't know what was happening in between, but you went to do silent running. Was there something that happened before silent running at all, or after 2001, or did you jump right into silent running?
Oh, and it's complicated because I came back to L.A. after working for Stanley, having not even been in L.A. for a long time. I was born in L.A.,
yeah.
My family was in L.A., and I'm kind of rattling around doing television commercials and kind of small visual effects service projects. I bought my first camera. I built my first animation stand. I rented a little office, and I said, "Oh, this is cool." And then I started thinking bigger, and I said, "Well, that guy Stanley Kubrick, I can do that." Not as easy as I thought, but I felt that I was kind of for some personal reason in my life, I was fearless and persistent, and so I decided to write a story, which became Silent Running. And I just happened through my connections with people I was doing television commercials and network IDs and stuff, met a producer, met some people at the studios who stumbled in by accident to this weird situation at Universal where they had watched, I can't remember which studio made Easy Rider. Who made Easy Rider?
I thought it was an independent film.
It was probably an independent film, but it was a movie that was made for almost nothing, came out of nowhere, and made, $100 million.
1969, that might have been that year.
Something like that. But anyway, Easy Rider shocked the entrenched production business. And it was completely against the grain. It broke
the rules.
Broke all the rules and made a lot of money. And so the management of Universal Studios decided to do this social experiment to give 5 directors an opportunity to make low-budget films where the studio would not read the script, they would not come on the set, they gave you final cut. As long as it was under $1 million, they didn't care. This, believe me, it's never happened again in my life. But that was the situation, and I had this little nirvana to make a low-budget movie, and I had to be really ingenious. We had to do this movie for, nothing, and with my friends, and we kind of cracked the studio, the labor unions in L.A. We said, well, if we have to hire union guys, we're not going to come in on budget, so the project is dead. But if we can mix the crew with students and union guys, we can do it. And so we found a balance. We made an agreement with the unions. We had a union DP, union gaffer, union operator, and things like that. But we had a lot of students from Long Beach State College.
Supplement.
Who became John Dykstra, who you probably know from a lot of visual effects, and many other people I've worked with over the years since then, were part of our little crew. And then they went on to do Star Wars.
Right.
The original ILM was a completely different ILM from what became known later.
Yep.
So we were continuing to explore and train people.
And you were using, for silent running, you used was it an aircraft carrier?
Yeah, believe me. I mean, I had this idea that I can't afford to build this set.
This is all supposed to take place in space
It's on a space on a space freighter in the future, and I said, well, we can't afford to build these sets, and I had this crazy idea. I don't know where these ideas came from. I said, well, maybe we could find some old Navy ship and make it look like it's a space freighter. And I went down to the Navy yards in Long Beach and started photographing ships. And I thought, actually, this is going to work. I shot some conning towers of various kinds of ships and then just painted the sky black and put stars and Saturn out there just to see what it would look like. And I thought, well, this is not bad. We ended up being able to rent from the Navy an entire disused aircraft carrier for $800 a week. Because it was up for scrap. It was going to be literally cut up for scrap steel and melted down. They didn't care about what we were going to do. They thought this was kind of cool artist guy. And they just assigned to us a chief petty officer guy who stayed with us and just said, you can do anything you want as long as you don't take any metal off this ship. And we had free run of a whole aircraft carrier for 4 or 5 months.
Wow.
32-day shoot. It was a very short shoot, but it was ingenious. And we went in there and with cutting torches and ripped out walls and put in our own design and made it look a little more futuristic than it really was. And we did it for very little money, just by taking advantage of a situation like that.
And you bought like costumes that were like scuba outfits?
No, they were ski outfits.
Ski outfits, and you put patches on them? And,
yeah.
And it works?
Yeah.
And what about the drones? So you had the drone. Now, one is called D2. Well, that was... No, it was Huey, Louie.
Huey, Dewey, Louie.
Yeah.
The idea came from Todd Browning's movie called The Freaks. And there was this fabulous performer in this movie called Johnny Eck.
Has anybody seen Freaks? Todd Browning's? He also directed, I think, the original Dracula.
Yeah, yeah. And this movie was a totally amazing movie. And one of the stars of this movie was this guy named Johnny Eck, who literally was truncated at the waist. There was no person there below his waist. He walked on his hands. And I was so impressed that he was not traumatized. He wasn't a weirdo. He wasn't psychotic. He was a really nice human, actually a very attractive guy. I thought, well, maybe we could take someone like that and put him in a robot outfit that didn't have anything anthropomorphic about it. Wouldn't have a head and legs or anything, and you wouldn't be able to figure out that there was a human being inside. And that was actually the seminal idea for silent running. Silent running started out based on that idea that we could do robots.
Yeah.
And I built everything around that idea.